Hi, everyone. First and foremost, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to each and every one of you for joining us tonight and being so understanding and flexible with our change of speakers. Your support and adaptability are greatly appreciated. Now I'm pleased to introduce you to the remarkable Dr. Jessica Bushey, our guest speaker for tonight's event. Dr. Bushey's journey as the chair of the working group on reference and access with the Interpairs Trust Research Group on Artificial Intelligence and Archives is awe-inspiring. With a PhD in Library, Archival, and Information Studies from the University of British Columbia, Canada, earned in 2016, they bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to our discussion. Dr. Bushey joined the faculty at San Jose State University in 2022 and currently teaches preservation management and reference and information services and archives. Prior to this, they served as adjunct faculty at the University of British Columbia and the University of Victoria. Additionally, Dr. Bushey held the position of archivist at Minova Archives of North Vancouver from 2018 to 2022. Notably, they also served as the digitation lead for the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia from 2006 to 2011, an experience that they will be discussing as the second case study in tonight's presentation. Dr. Bushey's dedication to the field of archives and their leadership in the working group on artificial intelligence and archives is truly remarkable. They are at the forefront of advancing our understanding of reference and access in the digital age. But before we dive into Dr. Bushey's insights, let's quickly review some guidelines for tonight's Zoom event. Please keep your microphones muted and cameras turned off during the presentation to minimize distractions. Feel free to use the chat features for questions and comments, and we'll address them during the Q&A session later. Now, without further ado, let's give a warm virtual welcome to the incredible Dr. Bushey. Thank you all for understanding flexibility and joining us for this enlightening discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Missy. What an amazing introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for staying with it and coming into this talk. So I'm going to talk about two different case studies. One of them is going to focus on the Museum of Anthropology's archives and the work that I did there, as Missy mentioned, from 2006 to 2011, in which I led a digitization project that what I'll start talking about is really the relationship between the archives and the larger museum, as well as their library that they have there. And it's a pretty unique type of archives when it's connected to a museum. So the other case study I'll talk about tonight is another job I had when I was the archivist for Minova, which was a museum and archives for North Vancouver. And so that had a little bit of a different structure as opposed to being connected to a university. It was municipal archives and more community-based. And again, it had this unique position in which it was part of a larger organization, but it was sort of this smaller section. And so in both these instances, advocacy for the archives was really important. And what I hope to impart in the talk tonight is that when you work in my experience, when you work in archives that are part of a larger organization, particularly a museum, it's very easy for the museum to be the star of the show and the archives to be the sometimes forgotten. Sometimes I feel almost like we serve the museum, and a lot of times what archivists do, the valuable collections that they have, and really the engagement and outreach activities that they're capable of can sometimes be overshadowed by the agenda of the museum. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about how do you deal with that? How can you raise the profile of your archives if you are connected to a museum? The other thing I will talk about as well is sort of the staff structure and how that can help or hinder amplifying the role of the archives within the organization. And I'll also talk about what I think are some interesting skills that maybe are not typically considered to be in the set of what an archivist or a librarian might learn when they're in a master's program, but how important they can be when you are trying to advocate for an archives within a larger museum. So I'm going to share my screen, and because I'm filling in, I don't have a PowerPoint tonight, but I did go through and open up a bunch of tabs on my browser, and I'm going to talk about those pictures so you don't have to look at me. And it'll hopefully be a lot more interesting for everyone. So the first thing that you're looking at is archival advocacy. So as part of this group, the SAA student chapter, I think it's really important that we're aware of resources that can help us in advocacy work. So the Society of American Archivists has a advocacy group, and on their website, you can actually find resources about advocacy. It's not something that gets talked about when we focus on archives, because really we typically talk about appraisal, arrangement and description, preservation. We don't, acquisition, for example, we don't usually focus in on advocacy, except for when we're talking a lot of times about maybe access. So for example, the course I teach, Info 284, which is on reference and information services, one of the modules is towards the end, involves advocacy, because I think it's one of those topics that often get overlooked, or it doesn't seem appropriate to put it with the functions of archival work. So in this tab here that you're taking a look at, this is the SAA's sampler on some books that will help you to understand advocacy a bit better. And I'm focusing on them right now because I do think, and I'll try and see if I can make that screen a bit bigger for everyone. There you go. I think it's really important to see that most of these references, some of them are a bit dated. SAAs, most of their advocacy texts, et cetera, seem to be kind of from pre-2020, which is okay. I think a lot of the fundamentals about it are the same, but I would definitely say that technology is our greatest friend. And there are a lot of advocacy activities that you can do that involve things like social media, online exhibitions, educational programming, that kind of outreach activities. And they would definitely involve online portals and social media. And so I think it's important that a different kind of web is one of the examples here as a book that you might be interested in getting or looking at. And of course, it's by Kate Beamer, who, if you don't know her work, has always been very cutting edge and very aware of the need to engage archival users in, online and using technology. The other thing in the middle is this public relations and marketing for archives. I have to say that if you have a background in marketing or advertising, or nowadays, I mean, my niece, who is in her early 20s, she's incredible at marketing herself just through Instagram and being online. So this might come naturally to some of you that I'm speaking with, but it's really important to market the archives. And that means you might be marketing up, which is what I talk a lot about in my class as advocacy, is so oftentimes you are selling your message or your value up the ladder of your organization. So oftentimes, especially for an archives that's within a larger museum, you will have a director of the museum. and archives. And they are typically have either a business background or a curatorial background, but I do not believe I have ever encountered a archival background. So right off the bat, you as perhaps an archivist, the director of the archives, or you are an assistant archivist, you are going to be trying to educate your boss about archives, about archival work, what it is you do, how difficult it is or how long it takes, and also about what archival materials are, how they're different from museum objects and how they're different from library books and special collections. And that might sound easy, but it can be a very difficult task. Typically within a structure of a museum, you may also have that your boss speaks directly to a board of directors. So then you have a whole nother set of individuals who you need to advocate to. You need to let them know why the archives are so amazing and what kind of activities the archives can do for the organization. So just to be aware that that is why public relations and marketing for archives is really a strong skill. And if any of you have that, then you should definitely be exploiting that if you're in a position, or even if you're going for an interview, be able to say to the people who are hiring you, yeah, you're great at social media, you're great at being able to create online exhibitions, you're really good at creating blog posts, and I'll show some examples of those as we move along the talk. And then the last one here is advocating within the institution, 25 years for the New York Philharmonic Archives. So case studies are really wonderful ways to look and see how other archives have managed to advocate for themselves. Now, the SAA, obviously, these texts are more generally focused. They're not just focused on museums and archives that work within museums. They are for any type of archives. And we have to remember that a lot of the lessons I'm going to be talking about tonight and the activities, they can apply for an archives within an organization, but they also can just apply to an archives as a standalone organization. I think if there is, one discipline that seems to be oddly misunderstood, it is definitely the discipline of archives. And most people do not understand when you say you're either an archival scholar or an archivist or you work in archives. They don't usually have an experience with an archives. They do definitely know what a library is, a museum, and an art gallery, but many people do not really know, nor have they stepped foot into an archive. So it's your job to explain that to them. So I just wanted, I know scrolling makes people want to throw up, so I'll just stop that as quickly as possible. But what's really important here is just being aware of, what is advocacy. And when we talk about it, I'm just going to flip to this next one. Can everybody see that? Can someone unmute and just say yes?
Yes.
Thanks. I think Caroline was saying yes. So in this, I just want to let you see that, okay, so Kathleen wrote, this is again available through SAA, wrote Advocacy and Awareness for Archivists. So this is a really great resource. It's from 2019. And I wanted to just bring up, like, what does this table of contents look like, so we can just have another bit more of a frame for tonight's conversation. So just defining advocacy and saying how fundamental it is for archives, talking about why archives matter, and then also talking about how do you connect the advocacy and awareness goals to the mission and strategic plan. So I'm going to show you a strategic plan at the end of this of my visuals so that you can start to see how that ties in. And the reason why it's important is that most institutions or organizations, whether they be public funded or privately, they typically create strategic plans and annual reports. And that is where they show their stakeholders, be they the public through taxpayers or a board of directors or a council, they have to show the value of both the museum and the archives. And they typically do that by reporting on statistical information such as quantitative stats, like how many people came in the door, how many people visited the website, to more qualitative things like, people who have written in to say that you helped them find the genealogical records of their ancestors. Or it can be translated into money, such as certain amount of donations came in, or new donors were found because of the high profile of the archives or of the museum. And so it's really important to start to realize that the more that you can talk about the value of the archives and archival work and have it be mirroring or linked to the mission and the goals of the larger organization, the more successful you will be and the more buy-in you will get from your boss or your board of directors and the administration. So this goes into things like understanding who your audience is, key stakeholders, super important. You got to know who it is that you need to convince, who you're talking to, developing a compelling message, putting advocacy and awareness into practice, talking to government officials. So that's really important. If you have a municipal community archives, you are always going to be having to talk to government officials and convince them of the value. And then taking the next steps. So sort of like, what is it that you think you can do for your archives, or what's the most appropriate set of activities? So I just wanted also to say that here's the next example. So the Museum of Anthropology, they have a library and archives. So this should appeal to a lot of you because they've actually bundled those two together and they share the same space. Yet what you'll find out is they sort of have a shared role in that both archives that I've worked at, because they're part of a larger museum institution, the archives has what we would call records of the institution, as well as donations from public figures or important people within the community. So they're both inward facing in that they serve the institution, and then they're outward facing in that they also will take donations and have public access to some of their collections. So right away, you can see that one of the skills you'd want to have if you're working within that type of an archives is the ability to be a records manager and also an archivist. Now, I know that that distinction doesn't get talked about too much, and I won't go into it in great detail, but it's important to see that you need to be able to help the curators, the director, the education programmer. You need to be able to help them find materials in the archives that they need, and they might be active records as an active records management, or they might be something that's been in the archives for 20 or 25, 35, 45 years. You also want to be able to develop a relationship with potential donors in the community, such as, depending on the type of museum you work for, it could be anthropologists, it could be archaeologists, it could be scientists if you're working in sort of a science museum. So there's quite a lot of activities that change the type of materials that you'll have in your archives and who will be using them. So when we look here, one of the things that I have found to be very interesting about both of the positions I've had in archives that were linked to a larger museum is that both museums I worked with underwent enormous renovations and building changes. And during that time, the archives was the only thing that was open for the public for short periods of time. So for example, for over 2 years when I worked at the Museum of North Vancouver and the archives there, Manova, they had no museum. So this was an opportunity, in my opinion, for the archives to shine. And they were desperate for engagement with their community. And really the only activities and materials for the community to access was in the archives. The same thing is happening right now with the Museum of Anthropology, and it also was happening when I was there as well too. There were huge redevelopment projects, and so again, the archives had an opportunity to shine, to sort of create blogs where before maybe that attention wouldn't have been given to the archives to have a blog or to create online archival exhibitions. That's one of the unique things about being in an archives that is connected to a museum, is the opportunity to do some pretty amazing exhibitions, typically online, because of course we don't want to display archival materials. Yes, we might display copies of them, but one of the greatest things about online exhibitions is being able to scan the originals and then have people have an experience with them online. So one of the things I wanted to point out here is right now, the archives at the Museum of Anthropology is actually getting to do this sort of online blog post exhibition called From the Archives, Designing a Museum. And you can see here that the Katie, who's the museum and digital asset archivist, has gone back and is having this opportunity, just even from the first sentence. In addition to its extensive object collection, the Museum of Anthropology also houses a valuable collection of archival materials. So you can tell by that first sentence that this is almost a promotional piece for the archives. It's an opportunity to inform people who would normally be going into the museum, not paying attention to the archives at all, to turn their attention to it. And we have new eyes on the archival materials. So they talk about the fact that right now, because the museum is closed, they start talking about all the different materials that are involved in the archival collection. And they give links to the online catalog. They have some examples here of sketches that were from 1973 of this particular building, and then some more stuff about where it's going to go, et cetera. So this is a very simple example, but it allows people to start to discover the archives. So I'm also going to show what this is the archives collections database, which is available online using an open source software called Access to Memory, which is used by a lot of organizations throughout the world who are archives. And I'm just showing an example here of, again, of course, this is another way to advocate for your archives. I know it might sound crazy, but you might actually enter into an archives that doesn't have an online collections database. And that would be one of the first steps that you would want to do, is say, we have to get our collections online, because people won't know about us unless we're there and we're accessible. Now, I'm showing you this because this is the archives online collection. And so you can see it's got this image. You can browse by digital objects. Here's a whole bunch of different images. And of course, when you click on them, these are kind of really stereographic ones. We can start to see, and we know as archivists, you can start to see some information's available. It's very much an archives database. It's got, files and series and items. So it is using archival arrangement and description. This is a finding aid. So it's still one of those things that we know people might be a little bit weirded out using. And so in contrast, what they've also started doing is they've started these stories. And this particular area is called Inside Library and Archives. This is what I mentioned when I talked about doing a blog. So here's a perfect example, and I hope everyone can see it, is this picture without words, the journey to identify archival images. So this was posted on February 21st, 2023. This is while the museum is closed. The archives is now posting this great blog in which they've gone through the trouble to take images, write some descriptions. And as we can see here, it's a great outreach piece or engagement and advocacy piece because it's drawing people in, it's telling them a story, and it's getting them interested in something that they might never have known about, except for the fact that right now the archives is closed, or the museum is closed. So you can just see here, there's more. They've been doing this for a little while. They have different things that they're focusing on. Sometimes they're talking about objects, but as you can see, they're always mentioning that, you know, it's coming from the archives. Either an archives assistant is talking about a piece or the research manager, etc. So I'm going to get to that in a second, or maybe I'll go to it right now. So as I mentioned before, it's really important to always think about how you are communicating the value of the archives to the larger organization, especially to stakeholders such as funding agencies or boards. So this is an annual report from the Museum of Anthropology for the years 2021 and 2022. Now, I'm not going to make us go through all of it. I've actually taken some time to just check out a couple pages here. So let me just go to page 22. Okay, so there are what, like over 30 pages, and I just want to point out that on page 22, in this small section here, is the section on the library and archives. So the entire report is about the museum, and here is this very small area. This is what's been allocated to the library and archives. This is their moment to shine, to talk about donations, to talk about activities, anything that they may have done with the public, any type of grants they may have received, etc. So again, being aware that you will get space in an annual report, but you won't get as much space. So you have to do as much as you can when you get it. Another thing I wanted to point out is that, and this is quite small, and I can't seemingly really, oh here, let's see if I can do it this way. Okay, so I wanted to point out down here that there's actually, Alyssa Cherry, I know this because I know her and went to school with her. Alyssa Cherry is the research manager. Her background is actually a master's in libraries and archives and information. So she has a dual master's, and that's just the way it's called at UBC, where she's actually taken the full, it's a 3-year master's. She's taken all the courses in library and information studies, and she's taken all the courses in archives that she can. And so she's a perfect person for running their archives and library because they only have to hire one person to do both sides. And so I'm pointing this out because all the other names are people that are connected to the museum. So it's very apparent when you look at a staff list where the emphasis is on, where the salaries are going. And so it's important if you are looking at an archives, maybe you're considering a job or you're trying to understand, you know, what is the relationship between the archives and museum or the archives library and museum at a larger organization, take a look at their annual report or their About Us staff list on their website, and it will reveal to you the amount of, let's say, resources that are being put towards the archives, the museum, and the library in that organization. And you'll also notice that a lot of times, and you can see it here, under student work, learns, interns, and postdoctoral assistants, because the Museum of Anthropology is connected to a university that has a wonderful master's program in library, archives, and information studies, they are able to draw upon a ready pool of wonderfully talented, very energetic students who typically are working in the library and archives. So here's two students who are working there who did great work while they were there. And so that's something to also be aware of, that it's oftentimes advocacy is used to get more staff positions for your archives. It's very hard to run a social media campaign, do all the archival functions, and then also support things like records management for the internal users with one person. But that often happens. And so if you can be an advocate for your archives, maybe you can actually get two positions, two full-time positions, not interns or, part-time positions or just working with volunteers. All of those people are extremely important to have in an archives, but it's really, really wonderful if you can have permanent full-time positions. Okay, so then I just wanted to also show you the difference between the museum's collections database, which is this one called MOA-CAT, and it's, let's see if we can make that bigger. You can just see it's a very different thing, even though it's working. I chose to show you works on paper, which in many ways can be very similar to doing scanning work in an archives. This is a very different setup. It's a very different look. It has different information. The effort that went into making this, I know because I was part of it. So it's definitely was more expensive initially to create. And what they've done is when the museum is open, there are kiosks throughout the museum, the physical space, as well as this online browser version where the public can interact with the digitized museum objects. And this is one of the projects that I led, which was photographing over 35,000 ethnographic objects and making them available through this really unique portal, which allows you to not only look at sort of what we would call quite basic metadata, but it will also allow you sometimes to connect that media to different curators or artists or people from all over the world and get a little bit more rich contextual information. So I just wanted to point out that even within a large organization with a museum and an archives, you will often have two totally different portals and access points, collections databases versus, an objects database. And it's important, part of your advocacy work, like I said when I started, is to really make sure that you can get the best software possible, that it is as user-friendly as possible, because it's very easy, again, for the archives to kind of disappear if people don't know about it and don't have access to it. So the last thing I'm just showing here is the Museum of Anthropology's Library and Archives Instagram page. I mentioned to you that social media is a good way of doing advocacy. So here is some examples from that. And then I will tie it in with going in the back door of the Museum of North Vancouver and the archives. So this is Manova's Instagram page. And you can see here, it's talking a bit about the archives. This is actually a picture of the archives room itself. So again, like I said, social media is a way to try and gain new users, but also to educate users about what services you have. And what I'll show here is this is part of the Manova's strategy. So its strategic report is available online, and unlike the Museum of Anthropology, which is connected to a university, Manova is a community archives and municipal archives. So it's connected to the municipality of North Vancouver. And you can see that a bit where it actually shows that the District of North Vancouver, their district city hall, this is how I've accessed this strategic plan. And so that means that annual funds are allocated to support the museum and archives in North Vancouver. And that's why if you want to advocate, you're not only advocating to your boss for resources, but you're also trying to influence the board of directors, which includes council members as well. So here I'm just showing an example of what often, I mean, they're infographics, right? They're basically, and this is kind of how people want to communicate. I mean, it'll change in a few years, but right now, this is what people love to see. And you can see in here that there'll be these are actually, some of them are quantitative data that's been turned into these sort of fun things to look at, like 20,000 online visitors. You can see here 43,000 items in the archives database. So the archives is competing here with the museum to try and get that information out there to people. This is an older like year-end report and strategic plan from the same organization before the museum was opened. I had mentioned that I worked there during the pandemic, and also while the museum was under construction. So the archives was the only gig in town at that point, which was great because we were allowed to do a lot of online exhibits and create a blog, do a lot of social media. We actually did a pandemic collecting project that was led by the archives because the museum wasn't open. And so you can see here that, again, you're getting things like 445 people visited the physical archives. Again, how many 17,000 page views of the archives collections database. So in this report, the archives is a bit more front and center because the museum wasn't open. And like I said, you have to seize those opportunities when you can, if you're in an organization. Make the most of sort of if something's closed or what's going on. So as I mentioned before, it's always important to take a look at staff. So for example, here at Minova, you know, they have one archivist and they have what they call a reference historian. And that in this particular case now, that reference historian has a master's degree in history. So another thing that's part about advocacy work is when I was working at Minova, we were involved with the union. We were involved with sort of reanalyzing staff positions that were connected to both the museum and the archives. And that was a time where we were trying to advocate for archivists to have a master's degree as a requirement for this primary position of archivist. Now, that might sound elitist or a bit crazy, but what you start to find out sometimes in an organization is that depending on the education required for a position, that will affect the pay scale. And so part of advocacy isn't often about like just the moment, it's about what comes after you. You may leave a position, but you always want to leave your archives better than when you found it. So if you can advocate for, you know, a higher skilled labor, better pay for the people who are working in the archives, more full-time positions in the archives, that kind of thing, then it's really worth it because, of course, we're trying to raise the importance of not only the physical archives, but the people who work there, and then, of course, the value of the materials that are being preserved. So there's just an example of that. So here is an example of the online collections database that's at the archives at Minova. It's a very, it's sort of more of a legacy approach. It still does allow searching and people can find things and look at the metadata of them in more closer detail, for example. Again, like I said, you absolutely want to make sure that you have something like a database so that you can show people what you're doing, what's in your archives, help them engage, help them order images, getting access, etc. And then another thing that I had spoken about before is this idea of creating a blog. So here's Minova's blog. This didn't exist before the pandemic, and we really advocated for the blog so that we would be able to keep in communication with our patrons while the museum was closed. And even the archives was temporarily closed for a bit as well. And so this way we could keep on working and then actually create interesting stories for people to learn more about the archives, etc. And so here's a perfect example. Get to know the archives of North Vancouver. And in this one, we actually, there's images of me in the background. There's an image of the archives that we had during the pandemic. Obviously, that's why people are wearing a mask. We have some discussions about what you can do at the archives, showing people on computers. We talk a bit about Archives Awareness Week. So that's more of a, a national advocacy activity, but by participating in that activity, again, you can start to increase the awareness of your particular archives. And that kind of gets me to another point that I wanted to talk about, which was partnerships. So because it's really hard to run like I said, in archives, do your own social media, write blog posts, take care of all the materials, it really helps if you can engage in partnerships or collaborations. And so an example of that I have on the screen is a project I did that grew out of a pandemic collecting project, but it gained the interests of the mayor of North Vancouver. And then I got invited to be part of a larger project that was about resilience and community strength. And so in the end, we did an oral history video project, and it was led by the archives, and it allowed us to meet and partner with a whole bunch of amazing grassroots organizations and social services that were available on the North Shore. And we were able to get a grant to fund this. And none of that would have happened without the collaboration that was offered through the mayor and through this group based on resiliency. And so I'm just trying to show here that, these are really fun videos that people can, well, they're not fun, they're intense because they talk about the pandemic, but they were great to make. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to open it up for questions, is that I'll get back to the point I made earlier, which is skills. So for a lot of these, because I had a background with photography and audiovisual, we were able to edit and do some of the video production and post-production on our own. But we also did find funds to support having professional video editors help us do that work and create these videos in a timely way so that they could be put online, they could have closed captioning, and that they were appealing for people to listen to and watch. And I'm not sure if we would have had that kind of attention and resource financially if it hadn't if we hadn't had a grant, if we hadn't had the backing of the mayor, and if we, weren't the only sort of active department during the pandemic and during that renovation time. So one of the things I will repeat is, you have to realize that when you create things like archival exhibitions online, or you create oral history video projects, that it's really, it draws upon skills that may not be something that you get in the master's education, but you may already have from prior work or prior professional experiences, or even volunteer experiences or hobbies. And those are really valuable, and you should definitely talk those up when you join any type of archives, or if you're in a job opportunity position, really mention that you have those other types of skills, because they're super, super important for raising the profile of an archives within an organization, and also within, online and nationwide. So that's where I'm going to stop, and hopefully we have time for questions and discussion.
We do. And thank you so much for that insightful and engaging presentation. That was awesome. Really, that was really awesome. And we now are going to move into our Q&A session. So if you could please type your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them. or Dr. Bushey will anyways. And you can also use your raise the hand feature and then come off mute if you feel comfortable doing that, and to ask your question directly. So if you have that, we'll try and look for them in the chat. Thank you so much.
So it looks like we do have a question from Jojo. In your experience, how do archivists prioritize the preservation of physical objects versus digital aspects in a collection?
Oh, okay. Well, basically the best way to do that is you usually will do some sort of survey of your collection, both physical and digital, and you prioritize what's at risk. And sometimes it just tells you because like you might have a really neglected amount of audiovisual material that you can smell is doing vinegar syndrome. And so you know that those materials, that media is degrading, and you do need to start doing preservation activities as soon as possible. Digital material, depending on how you've received it, can sometimes be extremely at risk, or it can kind of wait a while. Oftentimes, magnetic media, audiovisual, those are the ones that tend to need the most attention the soonest. So that's that's how, and also expertise, right? So if you're in an archives and you don't have that expertise in digital preservation, then you're probably not going to prioritize that. You're going to set it aside and ask to have a consultant come in, or you may not even acquire digital materials until you have someone on staff that can start to deal with their preservation issues. So yeah, it really is more like the loudest child gets attention in your archives. I hope that answered that. Emily has a hand up, or maybe it's just a high five. I like that idea, but it's just a high five. Yeah. Hi, Emily.
Hi, I'm just so glad I tuned into this, and thank you so much. It really pairs with something that I just experienced where I work as a student assistant in Sacramento, California. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time, but I think we all take it, well, at least those of us who are studying this, we just take for granted that, oh, of course archives will be around, of course they'll be supported, of course they'll be funded. And this presentation's a wake-up call for me. And then this experience I had just a few days ago was a wake-up call where our city has a deficit of $50 million. They have to cut the money somewhere. And they are asking all departments to make presentations to the council to basically make their case as to why they should continue to be funded. And our departments, and I was lucky enough to be able to tag along and go to the city council meeting and watch it in action and do exactly what you're talking about. We need to try and be aware of, participate in, perhaps even study along the side of marketing and basically selling your archives. And our director, we're under the umbrella of, I think it's called cultural and community something or other, but so she's in charge of that department, and we're a small archives within that. And her impassioned plea was like, it got a round of applause, and hopefully we will survive, everything will be fine. We're pretty substantial archives in our city, but just to hear her make this presentation and to tie it in with what you're saying, she talked about community involvement, she talked about how we do things with the schools, she talked about our archives crawl that's done every year, and to get the news out about our archives. So it was a great tie-in. Your presentation is like, oh, this really happens. You really have to make your case. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, you're totally right. And, it depends on people's personalities. I have always been into making things and speaking out. And I know a lot of archivists who really prefer the quiet work of archives. And although I love that, if you're the only archivist, like it was when I was in the situation with Minova, you're the only one there to make that plea and to try and get people interested in what you're doing. And then fund you. I mean, it's all about getting funding, right? It's exactly what you said. And it's easy for them to say, like, let's get rid of archives. It really, because most people just don't use it or don't understand it, right? And that's why I'm glad you mentioned the education. Both MOA and Minova have quite strong education programs that draw from the archives and their archival material. And I guess the last thing I would say on that too, and this sounds really petty, but I often found myself feeling that archives contribute to a lot of programming, but don't get recognized for it. So it'll come off as like a programming activity that's being done by, the museum, but all the effort that was put into it and the materials and the copies made were done by the archives. And it shouldn't be that way, that you have to say they did it so they can get some credit for it. But when it comes to allocating resources, funds, salaries, staff positions, that kind of stuff ends up mattering. I see a question here that says, which classes do you think we should prioritize, or do you think are the most valuable at San Jose State to pursue a career in archives? Well, definitely the 256, Info 256, that seems like a good place to start. And then, the preservation class, Info 259, I teach that. I know that it's also taught by other professors, but that would be a great course to take by any of us. And then, reference services, I know that it's taught for libraries, but I also teach Info 284, which is looking at it in archives. That's a good one. And then go make sure that you look at MARA, M-A-R-A, their range of classes. I know that the MLIS students can take several of the MARA classes and have it count towards your degree. So you can always take a look there. Any type of class that's talking about, digital preservation or metadata, very important for archivists to know about, for sure. Christine, thank you for mentioning advocacy for full-time archivist positions. I have two questions. Does the field of archives struggle with precarious labor? Yes. What is the value of being an archivist with the MLIS and another degree that demonstrates subject matter? Great. In the United States, that MLIS that's your, as far as I understand, that's really, your ticket, and you can have some courses in history or archives or an undergraduate in history or something like that. And, I'm sure you can get the jobs that you need. In Canada, it's a bit different. That's why some people do in Canada a joint degree where they're doing both MLIS and the MLIS and the MAS, just because we really do separate it, kind of like librarians do library and archives do archives, but it's not that way in the States. So I think, starting to take a few classes in what you really love, and if archives is what you love, great. Digital preservation is going to be, important for you if you're thinking about archives, for sure, because although we all want to just play around with daguerreotypes, or at least I do, we end up having to know, how to deal with different types of digital file formats and how to preserve those. But yeah, I mean, precarious labor, like I said, it's so much work in the cultural heritage area gets done by volunteers, interns. It's unfortunate. It's just as if like culture doesn't seem to really matter for the money. If you're an archivist that is connected to a business or a corporate archives, let's say Coca-Cola, Levi's, Disney, it's a whole nother game. I mean, you're going to earn a lot more money, and you won't have as much maybe public facing stuff, but you'll definitely have the archives being used for marketing and sort of anniversaries, et cetera. So it depends where you land. I find the archivists who go into the cultural heritage field sometimes struggle a bit more than if you go more corporate business. Then there's usually quite a bit of money to be made. You're welcome. Do you guys want to talk anything about SAASC and some of the wonderfulness about it?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a great question. I think Rebecca actually has some announcements that she wants to make as we wrap up here, or some
Hi,
links
everyone.
to share.
Oh, I can just do that now, if that works. Sure. So I'll put a couple links in the chat for stuff we've got coming up the rest of the month. As you may have seen, if you subscribe to our newsletter, we're currently in the process of switching to a new platform. So still just kind of working through that, but we do have the Secret Palantine mini activity coming up the week of Valentine's Day, which you can sign up for. We also have a member survey that if you get the chance to fill that out, just at some point in February, we're kind of being lax with the deadline. So yeah, that would be great just to get a sense of what everyone is interested in as far as being members of SAASC. And then just wanted to highlight again our giveaway from the January meetup, which was the 24 in 24 Archives bingo card. So that's just kind of a fun little extra thing that you can think about really throughout the whole year to get more involved and get out and get active in the field of archives. So I think that's what we've got going on. There is likely going to be a iSchool-wide student groups meetup coming up later this month. I don't think that there is a set date for that yet. And we're also hoping to have a SAASC kind of more formal member meeting later this month as well. So there's going to be more information about that going on or going out, excuse me. I think that's everything.
We do have
my
one.
end,
I do think we have one more speaker event we just scheduled today. I believe it's going to be March 14th, and we'll have more
great.
information coming out for that as
Perfect.
well.
Yeah.
But I think if there's nothing else, is there any more? If there's no more questions, I want to thank Dr. Bushey for coming out tonight. This was really amazing, and there was a lot of information, and it was really engaging. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for stepping in. I know that was really short notice, but it was so fun to have you here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.